The glowing blue on the phone screen didn't lie, even if Jake's mind desperately tried to. It was 11:45 p.m. on a freezing Tuesday in the Chicago suburbs. Savannah was supposed to be finishing a double shift at the Sunrise Cafe, smelling of stale coffee and fryer grease. Instead, her location was pinned perfectly to a quiet, dimly lit driveway on Elm Street, a neighborhood of vinyl-sided houses 3 miles away from the diner. Jake sat in the cab of his beat-up Ford, the engine ticking as it cooled. He watched the front door of the house open. The porch light flicked on, casting a harsh yellow glare on Savannah as she stepped out, laughing softly, followed by a man Jake had never seen. When Jake stepped out of the shadows, her laughter died instantly. She froze, the color draining from her face. But it was what Jake did next that shattered them completely. If stories of raw, unspoken heartbreak, where the loudest sound is a breaking vow, speak to you, stay with me. This isn't just a story about cheating. It's about the heavy silence that follows. The dashboard clock glowed a faint, clinical green in the darkness. 11:42 p.m. Jake Montgomery rubbed his thumb across the cracked screen of his smartphone, staring at the map. A small, pulsing blue dot rested over a gray square on Elm Street. It was a street he rarely drove down, nestled in a neighborhood where the driveways were paved and the houses had neat little porches. A far cry from the cramped, concrete sprawl of the riverside apartments they call home. Outside Jake's beat-up Ford, the Chicago wind howled, carrying the bitter promise of early winter snow. The heater in the truck had died 2 winters ago, but Jake didn't feel the cold. His blood felt like lead, heavy and frozen in his veins. Savannah was supposed to be at the Sunrise Cafe. Margie called in sick, she had told him that afternoon, tying her faded apron around her waist, avoiding his eyes just slightly. I have to cover the closing shift, Jake.
I'm sorry.
I know you're tired. He was tired. His shoulders ached from the endless, repetitive hauling at the Carter Industries bottling plant. His hands, resting on the steering wheel, were rough like sandpaper, scarred from jagged metal and long nights on the assembly line. But exhaustion was a familiar friend. This hollow, sinking terror in his chest, however, was entirely new. He had downloaded the family tracking app 3 years ago, right after a string of carjackings near the diner. It was for safety. It was supposed to be a digital tether of protection. Now it was a glowing indictment. Jake looked up through the windshield. The house across the street was quiet. No loud music. No party. Just a single, warm yellow light illuminating the front porch. He had been parked here for 40 minutes. Every minute had stretched into an agonizing hour. His mind desperately playing devil's advocate. Maybe she's delivering food. Maybe a coworker lives here and needed a ride. Maybe the app is glitching. But the blue dot hadn't moved. At 11:46 p.m., the heavy oak door of the house swung open. Jake stopped breathing. First came the sound of her laugh. A soft, careless sound he hadn't heard directed at him in years. Then Savannah stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing the floral dress she usually saved for Sundays, her diner uniform nowhere in sight. Right behind her was a man. He was taller than Jake, wearing a crisp, clean sweater that didn't smell like machine oil or factory sweat. The man reached out, wrapping a hand casually around Savannah's waist. She leaned into his touch, her face tilting up. Jake's hand gripped the door handle. The metal was freezing. The instinct of any man, the primal urge built by years of hard labor and protective love, screamed at him to storm across the street, to shout, to throw a punch that would shatter the quiet suburban night. He pushed the truck door open. The hinges groaned loudly in the stillness. Savannah's head snapped toward the sound. The man beside her dropped his hand. Jake stepped out of the shadows and walked into the pool of light spilling from the street lamp. He didn't run. He didn't stomp. His heavy work boots crunched against the frost-covered asphalt with a slow, deliberate rhythm. When Savannah recognized the broad, tired shoulders and the worn denim jacket of her husband, her entire body went rigid. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a ghost caught in the headlights. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the sudden collision of her two worlds. The man beside her puffed his chest out slightly, a mix of confusion and defensive apprehension crossing his clean-shaven face. "Hey, buddy, can I help you?" Jake didn't look at the man. His dark, exhausted eyes were locked entirely on his wife. He stopped 3 feet from the edge of the driveway. Savannah was trembling now, her eyes wide with a frantic, pleading terror. She braced herself for the explosion. She waited for the cursing, the rage, the heartbreak to tear violently from his throat. Instead, Jake reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the heavy, gray wool scarf she had left on the kitchen counter that morning. He tossed it gently. It landed softly on the frosted grass at her feet. "It's dropping below freezing tonight, Vanna," Jake said. His voice was devastatingly calm, void of any anger, void of any warmth. Just dead, flat acceptance. "You'll catch a cold." Without waiting for a response, without another glance at the man whose house his wife had just walked out of, Jake turned around, walked back to his freezing truck, and drove away into the dark. Under the taillights of Jake's Ford bled into the foggy suburban night, painting the frost-covered asphalt in a dull, retreating red. Inside the cab, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, dull thud of a worn-out tire hitting the seams of the concrete road. The broken heater blew a steady stream of dead, freezing air against his face, but Jake did not shiver. His hands, gripping the cracked leather of the steering wheel, were perfectly steady. The knuckles were white, not from rage, but from a terrifying, hollow paralysis. Back on the driveway of that neat, vinyl-sided house, Savannah was still standing exactly where he had left her. Tyler had likely asked her what the hell was going on, his voice thick with the confusion of a man who suddenly realized he was part of a tragedy he didn't fully understand. But Jake knew Savannah wasn't listening to Tyler. She was staring at the gray wool scarf on the frozen grass. Jake remembered the exact price of that scarf. It had cost him 2 consecutive overtime shifts on the bottling line 4 winters ago. 16 hours of lifting heavy glass, his lower back screaming, just so she wouldn't have to shiver waiting for the bus after her diner shifts. When he had wrapped it around her neck for the first time, she had buried her face in the thick material, closing her eyes and whispering that she felt like the luckiest woman in Chicago. Tonight, that same scarf was discarded evidence at the scene of a crime. He approached the intersection of 4th and Elm. The traffic light hung over the empty street, glowing a harsh, lonely red. Jake pressed the heavy brake pedal, bringing the truck to a shuddering halt. He sat there, the engine idling roughly. His left hand hovered over the turn signal. If he flicked it downward, he could make a U-turn. He could go back. He could drag Tyler out of his pristine, warm house by the collar of his clean sweater. He could scream until his throat bled, demanding to know why 7 years of marriage and a 5-year-old daughter weren't enough. But as he stared out the frost-rimmed windshield, his eyes drifted downward to the dashboard. The fuel gauge was resting dangerously close to the empty line. A small, amber warning light flickered to life. A bitter, dry laugh escaped Jake's throat, evaporating into a cloud of white vapor in the freezing cab. It was a brutal, pathetic realization. Anger was a luxury. Recklessness was a privilege for people who didn't have to calculate the cost of gasoline. If he drove back to Tyler's house, he might not have enough gas to make it to the Carter Industries plant for his night shift tomorrow. If he missed his shift, he would lose his overtime pay. If he lost his overtime pay, the electricity at the Riverside apartment would be shut off by Friday. Poverty didn't just steal their dreams. It had methodically eroded the foundation of their love, leaving Savannah vulnerable to anyone who could offer her a moment of financial safety and unhurried attention. And now, poverty was robbing Jake of his right to properly grieve his own betrayal. The traffic light clicked and flared green. Jake dropped his hand from the turn signal. He pressed the accelerator, steering the heavy, dying truck straight ahead, away from Elm Street, away from the warm yellow porch light, and away from the woman who had once been his entire world. The shadows of the industrial district soon swallowed the vehicle, wrapping him in the familiar, suffocating embrace of the life he was now chained to alone. So the industrial outskirts of Chicago rolled past Jake's window in a blur of chain-link fences and flickering sodium vapor lights. The rhythmic hum of the Ford's tires on the cracked pavement felt like a metronome, steadily counting down the final hours of his marriage. He kept the speedometer locked at exactly 40, dreading the moment he would pull into the cramped parking lot of the Riverside apartments. Going home meant the drive was over. Going home meant facing the empty half of their bed. As he passed the rusted, skeletal frame of an abandoned drive-in theater, a ghost from 7 years ago materialized in the passenger seat. It was Savannah, 22 years old, swimming in his oversized denim jacket. In his memory, she was laughing brightly, her hair blowing wildly through the open window as they ate cheap cherry popsicles. They had parked right by that dilapidated screen, making grand, foolish promises about the future. Savannah had pointed to the distant city skyline, swearing they would save enough to buy a small house with a wraparound porch and a yard for a dog. A porch with a warm yellow light, just like the one he had stood under less than an hour ago. The memory tasted like ash in his mouth. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to crush the phantom image before it could take root in his chest. The descent into their current reality hadn't happened overnight. It wasn't a sudden explosion that tore them apart, but a slow, suffocating erosion. It started with the unpaid medical bills from when their daughter, Lily, was born. It worsened with the sudden rent hikes and the skyrocketing cost of groceries. It solidified when Jake took the permanent night shifts at the Carter Industries plant for an extra $3 an hour, while Savannah picked up closing shifts at the Sunrise Cafe just to keep the lights on. They had slowly become roommates passing in the narrow hallway of their apartment. Jake would come home as the sun rose, smelling of industrial lubricants and exhausted sweat, just as Savannah was rushing out, her uniform smelling of stale coffee and fryer grease. Their conversations dwindled to logistical exchanges written on neon post-it notes stuck to the refrigerator. Milk is out. Rent is due Tuesday. Lily needs new shoes. Jake swallowed hard, the dry lump in his throat aching. He realized with a devastating clarity that Tyler Black hadn't just offered Savannah a clean sweater and a quiet street. The man had offered her the one thing Jake no longer had the currency to buy: time. Tyler had the luxury to sit at a booth in the diner, drink a slow cup of coffee, and actually look at her. Tyler had the energy to make her feel like a woman again, rather than just a co-manager of their shared poverty. He turned onto his street, the towering, brutalist concrete blocks of the Riverside complex looming against the starless night sky. The street lamps here buzzed and flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the litter-strewn sidewalks. There were no neatly manicured lawns here. There were no warm porches. Jake pulled into his designated parking spot and cut the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening. He looked up at the third-floor window of their apartment. The glass was dark. Inside, their 5-year-old daughter was asleep, clutching a stuffed bear that Savannah had bought with her tip money. The thought of Lily struck Jake like a physical blow to the ribs. The betrayal he had witnessed wasn't just a knife in his own back. It was an axe taken to the roots of his daughter's entire world. He slowly pulled the keys from the ignition. The metal felt heavy and cold in his calloused palm. He had spent the last 7 years destroying his body to build a raft for his family, only to realize his wife had quietly stepped onto someone else's ship. He opened the truck door and stepped out into the freezing wind, preparing to walk into a home that was already a tomb. Jake hadn't slept a single second. He had spent the remaining hours of the freezing night sitting in the dark living room, listening to the rhythmic, comforting sound of his 5-year-old daughter breathing in the next room. He had watched the sky turn from a bruised, absolute black to a sickly, industrial gray through the single window that overlooked the complex's overflowing dumpsters. By 5:30, the silent weight of the apartment had become too heavy to bear. He needed motion. He needed the familiar, numbing friction of a routine to keep his mind from snapping in half. When the rusted deadbolt of apartment 3B finally clicked open at 6:15, Jake was standing in the harsh fluorescent glare of the tiny kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled, its dying heating elements struggling to brew the cheap, generic grounds. He was methodically spreading peanut butter onto a slice of discount white bread for Lily's lunchbox. Savannah stepped inside. The heavy wooden door seemed incredibly difficult for her trembling hands to manage. She was still wearing the floral dress, the gray wool scarf clutched desperately to her chest like a frayed shield. Her makeup was ruined, her eyes bloodshot from a night spent in agonizing anticipation of a storm that never came. She had expected to walk into a war zone. Shattered plates, torn photographs, a husband consumed by a righteous, explosive fury. Instead, Jake didn't even look up from the cutting board. He sliced the crusts off the bread, his movements precise, economic, and utterly robotic. Savannah stood paralyzed in the narrow entryway. The apology she had rehearsed on the freezing walk home withered and died in her throat. The crushing weight of his domestic calm was 1,000 times more terrifying than any violence. Jake placed the sandwich into a plastic bag, sealed it, and tucked it neatly into Lily's pink lunchbox. Only then did he turn to face his wife. His dark, exhausted eyes swept over her. He took in the dress she had worn for another man, the smeared mascara, and his own heavy wool scarf wrapped around her shivering shoulders. But his expression remained a terrifying, impenetrable fortress. There was no hatred. There was no disgust. There was simply nothing. He looked at her the way he looked at a broken, obsolete machine on the assembly line. Something completely beyond repair, something he no longer had the tools or the energy to fix. He reached into the overhead cabinet, pulled out a chipped ceramic mug, and poured the remaining coffee. He set it on the laminate counter, pushing it exactly 2 inches toward the edge, her usual spot. "Lily needs to be at the bus stop by 7:30, Jake said. His voice was entirely flat, stripped of the gravelly warmth she had known since they were teenagers. "Her winter boots are still wet from yesterday. Have her wear the sneakers with the thick socks." Savannah's breath hitched, her chest heaving as a heavy sob tore its way up her throat. "Jake," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense pressure of her guilt. "Jake, please, say something. Scream at me. Hit the wall. Please just do something." He picked up his heavy steel thermos, twisting the cap shut with a sharp, final screech of metal on metal. He picked up his lunch pail, the worn plastic handle familiar against his calloused palm. He walked past her toward the front door, the scent of industrial soap and deep, marrow-deep exhaustion trailing behind him. He didn't flinch. He didn't pause. He didn't offer her the absolution of his anger. "I picked up a morning overtime shift at the plant," Jake said, pulling his faded denim jacket off the brass hook. "Don't wait up." The door clicked softly shut behind him, sealing Savannah inside the apartment. She collapsed against the faded wallpaper, sliding down to the cold linoleum floor as the old iron radiator hissed. Sitting in the shadows of the hallway, she finally understood the true horror of her betrayal. Jake wasn't fighting for her, because he had already surrendered. The bell above the glass door of the Sunrise Cafe chimed relentlessly, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt like a needle driving directly into Savannah's temple. It was the peak of the Tuesday lunch rush, a chaotic, suffocating symphony of clattering ceramic plates, sizzling grease from the flat-top grill, and the low, overlapping roar of 30 different conversations. Normally, Savannah navigated this narrow, faded diner with the practiced grace of a seasoned dancer, capable of balancing 3 scalding plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes on a single arm while taking a new table's order. Today, her limbs felt as though they were moving underwater, weighted down by an invisible anchor of irreversible guilt. She stood frozen at the server station, staring blankly as dark liquid overflowed the rim of a thick ceramic mug, spilling scalding hot coffee over her knuckles. She didn't even flinch. The physical burn was an absolute relief compared to the suffocating void Jake had left in her chest that morning. "Hey!" Earth to Vanna. A hand gripped her shoulder, pulling her roughly back from the edge of the counter. Megan Taylor, a veteran waitress whose blonde hair was tied back in a messy, practical bun, quickly grabbed a stained bar towel and wiped up the spill. Megan had been slinging hash at the Sunrise for 10 years. She had a sharp tongue, a heart of gold, and an uncanny ability to read people like an open menu. "Are you trying to melt your own skin off?" Megan snapped, though her brown eyes were filled with genuine concern. She studied Savannah's pale, drawn face and the dark, bruised circles under her eyes. "You've messed up table 4's order twice, you gave the trucker in the corner a decoff, and you look like you just watched a ghost walk out of your own living room. What the hell is going on with you?" Savannah tried to swallow the jagged lump in her throat. She gripped the edge of the stainless steel counter, her knuckles turning white.
"I'm fine, Mai.
Just didn't sleep well. Lily was up all night with a cough." It was a pathetic lie, and they both knew it. Megan aggressively tossed the wet towel into a nearby bus tub and grabbed Savannah by the elbow, steering her forcefully through the swinging metal doors and out into the cramped, humid alleyway behind the kitchen. The heavy, freezing Chicago wind hit them instantly, but the scent of discarded onions and bleach offered a strange, private sanctuary from the noise of the dining room. "Don't give me that crap about the kid," Megan said, lighting a cheap cigarette with a flick of a neon plastic lighter. She exhaled a thin stream of gray smoke into the winter air, crossing her arms defensively. "You're shaking like a leaf. Did Jake finally lose it? I told you, a man can only work those night shifts for so long before his brain snaps from the exhaustion. Did he hit you? Because if he laid a hand on you, I swear to God." "No!" Savannah interrupted, her voice cracking violently. The very idea of Jake being violent felt absurd, almost laughable in its inaccuracy. A single tear finally broke free, tracing a hot path down her freezing cheek.
"Nu, Mai."
"He didn't hit me. He didn't even yell." She leaned her back against the rough brick wall, sliding down slightly as her exhausted legs threatened to give out. The image of Jake methodically cutting the crusts off Lily's sandwich played on a cruel, endless loop in her mind. The terrifying emptiness in his dark eyes when he looked right through her. "That's the problem," Savannah whispered, burying her face in her trembling hands. The smell of the diner grease clung to her skin, a sickening reminder of the working-class life she had tried to momentarily escape with Tyler. Tyler's pristine house, his clean sweaters, his unhurried mornings. None of it mattered now. It all felt like a cheap, plastic illusion compared to the devastating reality of the home she had destroyed. "He caught me, Meg. He tracked my phone. He followed me to someone else's house last night. And he didn't scream. He just handed me my coat and drove away. This morning, he looked at me like I was already dead." Megan froze, the cigarette halting halfway to her lips. The tough, seasoned waitress was completely disarmed. She stared at Savannah, the brutal realization slowly settling over her features. "Oh, honey," Megan breathed out, the smoke curling slowly around her words. "A screaming man is just a man in pain. You can work with pain. You can apologize to anger. But a silent man? A silent man has already packed his bags." Savannah let out a choked, ugly sob, sliding all the way down to the cold concrete. She pulled her knees to her chest, sitting among the rusted dumpsters of the diner, finally understanding the true magnitude of her husband's coldness. Jake hadn't just walked out of Tyler's driveway. He had quietly, methodically walked out of their marriage, leaving her entirely alone in the wreckage. The roar of the Carter Industries bottling plant was a physical force, a suffocating wall of sound built from grinding steel gears, hissing pneumatics, and the endless, shattering clatter of thousands of glass bottles. For 7 years, Jake had relied on this deafening mechanical symphony to drown out his thoughts. The assembly line demanded a mindless, rhythmic perfection that usually offered a strange kind of sanctuary from the anxieties of unpaid bills and a fading marriage. But today, the noise could not penetrate the absolute, terrifying silence inside his own head. Jake stood at Station 4, his heavy, steel-toed boots planted firmly on the rubber anti-fatigue mat. His hands, clad in thick, rubberized gloves, moved with the autonomous precision of a machine. Grab the defective bottles. Toss them into the metal cullet bin. Wipe the optical sensor. Repeat. Every 4 seconds, a new batch of green glass slid past his vision. Every 4 seconds, a pulse of phantom memory hit him. The blue on his phone, the warm yellow porch light, the gray wool scarf resting on the frozen grass. He did not feel the burning ache in his lower back or the familiar, sharp sting of a fresh glass cut slicing through his glove from the previous shift. He was entirely hollowed out, moving through the thick, ozone-scented air like a ghost haunting the miserable corridors of his own life. Hey, Earth to Montgomery! A heavy hand clapped against Jake's shoulder, jolting him slightly. He did not flinch, merely turning his head with agonizing slowness. Dan Williams, a burly man with engine grease permanently tattooed into the deep creases of his face, was shouting over the roar of the conveyor belt. Dan had worked beside Jake for 5 years. They shared a mutual, unspoken understanding forged in the trenches of blue-collar survival. They didn't talk about their feelings or their failing dreams, but they always noticed when a man was quietly drowning. "You missed 3 cracked necks in the last minute, brother?" Dan yelled, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the cullet bin, which was unusually empty for Jake's station. "Foreman catches that, he's gonna dock your overtime pay. You sleeping with your eyes open again?" Jake stared down at the empty bin. He hadn't even realized his hands had stopped moving. He blinked, the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights overhead stinging his dry, bloodshot corneas. "Yeah," Jake rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "Just tired, Danny. Minding the machine." Dan narrowed his eyes, leaning in closer. The smell of cheap thermos coffee and stale tobacco rolled off his coveralls. Dan wasn't buying it. He had seen Jake work through 102-degree fever and a sprained wrist without missing a single beat. This wasn't fatigue. The absolute, dead-eyed stare Jake was giving the conveyor belt was something entirely different. It was the look of a man who had just watched his house burn to the ground with everything he owned inside it. "Savannah giving you hell about the extra shifts again?" Dan pressed, his tone dropping the usual factory banter, replacing it with a rough, probing concern. "Listen, man, I know the money is tight, but you can't run yourself into an early grave. Take a weekend. Take her somewhere nice. The line will survive without you for 2 days." The mention of her name felt like a physical hook catching viciously under Jake's ribs. Take her somewhere nice. Tyler Black had already taken care of that. Tyler, with his pristine sweaters and his quiet, warm house, had provided the comfort and the attention Jake had been killing himself on this factory floor to afford. Jake's jaw tightened until the muscle ticked. The primal instinct to spill it all, to tell Dan about the tracking app, the stranger in the driveway, the suffocating realization that he had sacrificed his body for a woman who no longer respected him, rose violently in his throat. But what good would it do? Pity wouldn't pay the rent. Sympathy wouldn't fix the fractured reality his 5-year-old daughter was about to inherit. "It's not Savannah," Jake lied, turning back to the relentless flow of glass bottles. He grabbed a cracked one and hurled it into the metal bin with a sudden, forceful crash that made even Dan step back. "Just tired, Dan. Let me work." Dan stared at him for a long, heavy moment before giving a slow, reluctant nod. "All right, just keep your head down." As Dan walked back to his station, Jake resumed his mechanical rhythm. Grab, toss, wipe, repeat. The factory roared around him, but Jake was trapped entirely in his own silent, bitter orbit, realizing that the absolute hardest part of a broken heart wasn't the initial shatter. It was having to wake up the next day, clock in, and go to work anyway. Sir Jake's boots felt like cinder blocks as he climbed the 3 flights of concrete stairs to apartment 3B. It was past 9 in the evening. 16 straight hours of the assembly line's brutal, mechanical rhythm had stripped away everything but the primal need to collapse. He turned the key in the lock, the metallic click echoing loudly in the damp, quiet hallway. When he pushed the door open, the apartment was not dark. The cheap floor lamp in the corner of the living room cast a sickly yellow glow over the worn-out fabric of their couch. Savannah was sitting there, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She hadn't been to sleep. She looked fragile, stripped of the diner uniform and the floral dress, wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt that only magnified her nervous trembling. The television was off. The silence in the room was so thick it felt difficult to breathe. Jake closed the door quietly behind him. He didn't acknowledge her. He went through his mechanical routine, unlacing his steel-toed boots, placing them exactly on the plastic mat, hanging his faded denim jacket on the brass hook. Every movement was agonizingly slow, a deliberate conservation of whatever meager energy he had left in his muscles. "Lily is asleep," Savannah said. Her voice was a frayed, brittle thread, slicing through the heavy air. She had her dinner. I read her a story." Jake nodded once, a sharp, robotic tilt of his chin. He walked past the living room toward the cramped kitchen, turning on the faucet to scrub the industrial grease from his calloused hands. The harsh scent of heavy-duty pumice soap filled the small space. Savannah couldn't take the quiet anymore. She stood up, her bare feet patting softly against the cheap linoleum as she followed him. She stood near the doorway, watching his broad, hunched back as he methodically scrubbed his knuckles with a stiff brush. "Jake, please," she begged, the tears she had been holding back all day finally spilling over her lashes. "You can't just ignore this. You can't just act like nothing happened." He shut off the water. The sudden absence of the rushing sound made the room feel even more claustrophobic. He reached for a towel, drying his hands with the same agonizing slowness. He finally turned to face her. His dark eyes were bottomless, reflecting absolutely nothing of the yellow kitchen light. "I'm not ignoring it, Savannah," he said. His voice was utterly devoid of inflection. "Then yell at me," she screamed, the sudden volume startling in the small apartment. She stepped forward, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Call me a whore. Throw a plate at the wall. Do something. Damn it. I know what I did. I know it was unforgivable. But you have to understand. I was just so lonely, Jake. We're like ghosts in this place. We pass each other in the dark. Tyler, he just listened to me. He made me feel like I existed again." She collapsed against the counter, sobbing openly now, offering him the ugly, pathetic truth of her betrayal in exchange for the familiar comfort of his anger. She waited for the explosion. She braced for the impact of his rage, desperate for the punishment that would somehow balance the heavy scales of her guilt. Jake looked down at her shaking shoulders. He didn't feel the primal urge to raise his voice. He didn't feel the fiery heat of jealousy. He just felt a crushing, infinite exhaustion that settled deep into his bones. "I worked 16 hours today," Jake said, his tone terrifyingly level. He tossed the towel onto the counter beside her trembling hand. "I lifted 8 tons of glass. My back is spasming, and my hands are bleeding inside my gloves. I did it to pay the electricity bill that's pinned to the refrigerator behind you. The one that keeps this kitchen warm." Savannah slowly raised her head, her tear-streaked face pale with absolute dread. "You wanted me to make you feel like you existed," Jake continued, looking directly into her red, swollen eyes. "But I spent every ounce of my existence just trying to keep a roof over yours. I don't have the energy to scream at you, Vanna. Tyler can have your loneliness, because I have to go to sleep so I can wake up and pay for the bed you're crying in." He walked past her, leaving her utterly devastated in the harsh fluorescent light, and shut the bedroom door with a quiet, final click. The bedroom was suffocatingly dark, smelling faintly of Savannah's cheap lavender lotion and the lingering metallic tang of the factory that seemed permanently etched into Jake's skin. He lay on his back, fully clothed on top of the faded quilt, staring blindly at the invisible water stain on the ceiling. He could hear Savannah's muffled, rhythmic crying from the living room couch on the other side of the thin drywall. A few months ago, that sound would have driven a desperate spike of panic through his chest. Tonight, it registered as nothing more than background noise, like the distant rumble of the freight trains that shook the apartment building every passing hour. She thought last night was the beginning of the nightmare. She thought the glowing blue dot on the family tracking app was the sudden match that lit the fire. That was her tragedy. She severely underestimated him. Jake slowly rolled over, his aching spine popping in the quiet room. He reached under the heavy mattress, his calloused fingers brushing against the cold metal of a small, rusted Altoids tin he kept hidden near the wooden bed frame. He pulled it out, prying the stubborn lid open with his thumb. Inside was not a stash of emergency cash, nor a cherished family heirloom. It was a single, crumpled piece of thermal paper. The ink was beginning to fade, but the harsh, printed letters were permanently burned into Jake's memory. Harborview Restaurant, Table 12. Date, May 14th. 2:15 p.m. 2 glasses of Merlot. 1 artisan cheese board. Total, $68. He had found it 6 months ago, wedged deep in the lining of Savannah's winter coat, when he was frantically looking for a lost tube of lip balm for Lily. May 14th was a Tuesday. Savannah had sworn she was working a double shift at the Sunrise Cafe, covering for Megan, who had a dentist appointment. The Sunrise Cafe didn't serve $60 wine, and Savannah certainly didn't drink it. He remembered the exact moment his world had stopped spinning. He had stood in the cramped hallway, the receipt trembling in his dirt-stained hand, feeling the absolute, terrifying freefall of a man who realizes the solid ground beneath him is merely a painted illusion. He had nearly confronted her then. He had almost thrown the crumpled paper in her face when she walked through the door hours later, smelling faintly of an expensive, woodsy cologne that didn't belong to him. But then Lily had run out of her bedroom, her small face lighting up, throwing her arms around Savannah's knees, yelling with pure, unadulterated joy, "Mommy's home!" Jake had looked at his daughter's radiant, unbroken smile. He had looked at the peeling wallpaper of their apartment, the stack of past-due utility bills on the kitchen counter, the sheer, fragile thread holding their poverty-stricken lives together. If he blew up the marriage right then, Lily would be the immediate collateral damage. She would be split between two homes they couldn't afford. She would grow up with the trauma of a shattered foundation, watching her parents tear each other apart over pennies and pride. So Jake had made a choice. He had folded the receipt, placed it in the tin, and swallowed the poison. For 6 agonizing months, he had kissed a wife he knew was tasting someone else. He had worked grueling double shifts to pay for the gas she used to drive to Tyler Black's house. He had absorbed the disrespect, brick by brick, building a massive, suffocating fortress of denial just to protect his daughter's innocence. Tracking her phone last night wasn't a sudden discovery. It was a surrender. It was the moment Jake's battered, exhausted spirit finally admitted that the foundation had already completely crumbled, and he simply no longer had the physical or mental strength to hold up the ceiling alone. He put the receipt back into the tin, snapped the metal lid shut, and closed his eyes, welcoming the cold, absolute numbness that had finally come to claim him. The freezing wind whipped violently through the concrete canyons of the Riverside apartment complex on Wednesday afternoon. Jake zipped up his faded denim jacket, his breath forming thick clouds of white vapor as he walked toward his battered Ford. He had 4 hours of sleep between shifts and a persistent, dull ache radiating from his lower spine. Before he could reach the driver's side door, a sleek, immaculately clean silver sedan pulled up, blocking his exit. The engine purred smoothly, a stark contrast to the rough, dying idle of Jake's truck. The driver's door opened, and Tyler Black stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. He was wearing a dark, tailored peacoat and polished leather boots. Against the backdrop of the overflowing, rust-stained dumpsters and the towering, brutalist architecture of the low-income housing, Tyler looked like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong movie set. Tyler slammed his car door, his jaw set in what he clearly believed was a mask of righteous determination. "Montgomery," he called out, closing the distance between them. Jake stopped. He didn't drop his lunch pail. He didn't clench his heavy, calloused fists. He simply stood there, his dark eyes observing the man who had dismantled his family with the detached curiosity of a graveyard shift worker watching a stray dog. "Savannah called me crying from the diner's bathroom," Tyler said, his voice tight, attempting to project authority. "She said you haven't spoken a single word to her in 2 days. You're just walking past her like she's a ghost. It's cruel, man. It's psychological torture. If you're angry, you take a swing at me. You don't punish her with this sick silence." Jake let the freezing wind howl for a long moment. He looked at Tyler's perfectly manicured hands, noting the absence of dirt beneath the fingernails, the absence of scars on the knuckles. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it all astounded him. Tyler genuinely believed he was the white knight rescuing a damsel from a negligent beast. "You think this is a movie," Jake said. His voice was incredibly quiet, scraping against the frigid air like rusted iron. Tyler blinked, momentarily thrown off by the absolute lack of hostility. "What?" Jake took a slow step forward. He smelled of industrial degreaser, stale coffee, and marrow-deep exhaustion. "You think you rescued a princess from a tower. You bought her a $60 lunch. You poured her wine in a quiet house. You let her complain about the electricity bills, and you made her feel like a tragic heroine." Jake raised a heavy, scarred finger and pointed it at the crumbling brick facade of the apartment building behind them. "That is not a tower," Jake said, his voice dropping into a register of devastating, undeniable reality. "That is real life. There is a 5-year-old girl on the 3rd floor who needs extensive dental work next month that insurance won't cover. There is a stack of medical bills from a bad flu season 3 years ago that I am still paying off. The transmission in Savannah's car is going to blow before Christmas, and the radiator in that apartment leaks every time it snows." Tyler swallowed hard. The heroic, protective posture he had practiced on the drive over began to visibly deflate under the crushing weight of Jake's gaze. "You want her?" Jake asked, his dark eyes locking onto Tyler's wavering stare. "Take her. But understand this, Black. You don't just get to keep the pretty girl in the floral dress on a Tuesday afternoon. You get the debt. You get the grinding exhaustion. You get to explain to a little girl why her family is broken. You get to step into my shoes." Jake stepped around Tyler, utterly dismissing him. He opened the creaking door of his Ford and tossed his lunch pail onto the passenger seat. "Let's see how long those clean sweaters of yours last," Jake said, not looking back. "When you have to work 80 hours a week just to keep her warm." Jake started the engine, the loud, grinding noise shattering the quiet. As he backed out of the parking space, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Tyler Black was standing completely still in the freezing wind, staring up at the grim, towering reality of the Riverside apartments, the romantic illusion of his little affair rapidly freezing over in the Chicago cold. So the radiator in the corner of the living room hissed, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to slice through the oppressive silence of apartment 3B. Savannah sat completely still on the edge of the faded floral sofa, her hands resting limply in her lap. It was Thursday evening. The sky outside the narrow window had already bruised into a dark, freezing purple. Since the brief encounter in the parking lot, which she had watched from the 3rd-floor window, seeing her husband quietly dismiss her lover like a mild inconvenience, something fundamental had shifted. Tyler hadn't called her. The pristine silver sedan had driven away, and with it, the flimsy, romanticized illusion of her affair had evaporated into the harsh Chicago winter. But that wasn't what was breaking her. What was breaking her was the sheer, terrifying emptiness of the man walking around her kitchen. Jake had come home from his shift an hour ago, washed his hands with the harsh pumice soap, and eaten a bowl of canned soup standing over the sink. He hadn't slammed the cabinet doors. He hadn't glared at her. He had moved with the precise, detached efficiency of a man clearing out a hotel room before checkout. Savannah stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She walked into the short hallway, her bare feet silent against the peeling linoleum. She stopped in front of the small, overloaded coat rack. Jake's heavy denim jacket was hanging there, smelling faintly of ozone and exhaustion. Beneath it, his backup pair of steel-toed boots were lined up perfectly. For 7 years, she had viewed this apartment as a trap. She had resented the water stains on the ceiling, the drafty windows, the constant, suffocating arithmetic of survival that dictated their every conversation. She had allowed Tyler's soft voice, his unhurried lunches, and his clean sweaters to convince her that she deserved a softer life. She had let herself believe she was a tragic heroine trapped in a loveless grind, starved for attention. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the rough, cold canvas of Jake's jacket. In her desperate, naive mind, she had always believed that if she ever crossed the line, there would be a massive theatrical explosion. She thought Jake would fight for her. She thought his rage would be the violent proof of his love, a fiery confirmation that she still mattered enough to break his heart. She had wanted him to tear the apartment apart, to scream his lungs out, to demand her back from Tyler. She slowly slid down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest right there in the narrow hallway. The revelation hit her with the crushing force of a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. The opposite of love wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. The opposite of love was the absolute, hollow indifference radiating from the man in the next room. Jake wasn't punishing her with his silence. He wasn't playing a psychological game to break her down, nor was he waiting for a dramatic apology. He had simply looked at the betrayal, calculated the emotional cost of surviving it, and realized his accounts were completely empty. He had already let her go. The apartment suddenly felt like a tomb. The air was thick and stale, holding the ghosts of the family they used to be. Savannah pressed her face into her knees, the tears falling silently now, stripped of all their dramatic, self-pitying flair. There was no one left to perform for. Tyler had fled from the heavy, grinding reality of her life, and Jake had already packed up his soul and vacated it. She had traded the solid, exhausted devotion of a man who worked himself to the bone for her, all for a cheap, temporary fantasy. And now, surrounded by the walls she had complained about for years, she was entirely, utterly alone. So the sharp, violent screech of packing tape tearing from the roll echoed through the cramped bedroom on Friday morning. It was a terribly mundane sound, yet it carried the absolute finality of a gavel striking wood. Jake stood over the mattress, methodically folding his few possessions into a faded, olive-green canvas duffel bag he had owned since high school. 3 pairs of worn denim jeans, 4 heavy flannel shirts, the thick, rubberized work gloves he used at the bottling plant. He didn't have much. 7 years of backbreaking labor had yielded a roof over his family's head and food in their refrigerator, but almost nothing to his own name. Savannah stood paralyzed in the doorway, clutching the doorframe as if the floor beneath her were violently tilting. She watched him fold a faded gray t-shirt, the very shirt he had worn the day they brought Lily home from the hospital. "What are you doing?" Savannah whispered, her voice trembling.
Jaque, no.
"You can't. It's your name on the lease. You pay the rent." He didn't stop packing. He zipped the side compartment of the duffel bag, the metallic sound harsh in the quiet room. "The rent is paid through the end of November," he said, his voice carrying that same terrifying, hollow calmness. I'll keep depositing my check into the joint account on the first of the month. It covers the apartment, the electricity, and groceries. But you need to pick up extra shifts at the diner to cover your own gas and the water bill. Savannah stepped into the room, panic finally overriding her paralyzing guilt. I'm the one who did this, she cried out, tears spilling over her red, exhausted eyes. I'm the one who ruined it. I should be the one leaving. You shouldn't have to pack your bags, Jake. This is your home. Jake finally stopped. He slowly turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the grim, suffocating reality of their socio-economic status. And go where, Savannah? He asked, his tone devoid of malice, functioning merely as a brutal ledger of their reality. You have $62 in your checking account. The wait list for subsidized housing in Chicago is 3 years long. A new apartment requires first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. That's $3,000 we don't have. He took a slow, heavy breath, his broad shoulders slumping slightly under the invisible weight of his responsibilities. Are you going to take Lily to a homeless shelter? Jake asked, staring directly into her soul. Are you going to drag my daughter to Tyler Black's pristine suburban house, hoping he's willing to play stepfather to a 5-year-old just because he liked buying you a glass of wine on a Tuesday afternoon? Savannah flinched as if he had struck her across the face. The illusion of Tyler had already completely evaporated. She knew with absolute, sickening certainty that Tyler would never open his door to her baggage. No, Savannah sobbed, dropping her face into her hands. No, I can't. Exactly, Jake said, turning back to the bed and grabbing the heavy brass zipper of his duffel bag. So you stay here. Lily's school is 2 blocks away. Her bed is here. Her life is here. I am not going to let your mistake tear down the only stable walls my daughter has ever known. Where will you sleep? She pleaded, looking at the freezing frost already gathering on the bedroom window. Jake, it's going to snow tonight. I have the truck, he replied smoothly, hoisting the heavy bag over his shoulder. And Dan said I could use the locker room at the plant for a few hours between shifts. The heater in their works. Savannah fell to her knees, the absolute, crushing weight of his sacrifice breaking her completely. He wasn't doing this out of lingering love for her. He was doing this because he was a father, a man who would gladly freeze in the cab of a dying Ford just to ensure the woman who betrayed him could keep his daughter warm. She realized then that Jake Montgomery was the strongest, most honorable man she would ever know, and she had thrown him away for absolutely nothing. For the final Saturday of November arrived with a sky the color of lead and a biting wind that rattled the thin, single-pane windows of apartment 3B. On the small, scratched laminate table where they had celebrated Lily's birthdays and agonized over tax returns, a single sheet of paper lay flat. It was the legal separation agreement, a cold, clinical document that reduced 7 years of struggle, sweat, and shared dreams into bullet points and signatures. Jake stood by the front door, his olive-green duffel bag already sitting on the landing outside. He was wearing his heavy work jacket, his hands tucked deep into the pockets to hide the slight, involuntary tremor in his fingers. Savannah sat at the table, the pen clutched in her hand like a weapon she didn't know how to use. Her face was gaunt, the vibrant woman she had been months ago now a shadow, hollowed out by the realization that some things, once broken, cannot be glued back together, no matter how much salt you pour into the wounds. Sign it, Vanna, Jake said. His voice was no longer flat or cold. It was simply tired, a deep, ancient exhaustion that seemed to come from his very marrow. Lily is at your mother's for the afternoon. She doesn't need to see this. With a shaking hand, Savannah scrawled her name. The ink bled slightly on the cheap paper. She pushed the document toward him, her eyes searching his face for any flicker of the boy who had once promised her the world at the drive-in theater. Is this really it? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the radiator. 7 years, Jake. We were supposed to be the ones who made it. We were supposed to get that house with the porch. Jake picked up the pen. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name with the same steady, mechanical precision he used to log his hours at the plant. He laid the pen down and reached into his pocket, pulling out his set of brass keys. He placed them on top of the paper. They made a sharp, metallic clink that felt like a funeral bell. The house with the porch was a dream for people who have time to sleep, Vanna, Jake said softly. He looked around the cramped, peeling living room one last time. We were just trying to survive. I guess I was the only one who realized that survival is a full-time job. He turned toward the door, his hand gripping the cold brass knob. Jake, she called out, standing up so abruptly her chair scraped harshly against the linoleum. Do you think you can ever forgive me? Not for the apartment or the money, but for making you feel like you weren't enough? Jake paused, his back to her. He thought about the 6 months he had spent carrying that crumpled receipt in a tin box. He thought about the freezing nights he had just spent sleeping in the cab of his truck, his breath frosting the glass, just so she could keep the bed. He thought about the fact that he still had to go to work in 4 hours to pay for a life he no longer lived. I didn't stop loving you, Savannah, he said, his voice cracking just enough to reveal the shattered remains of his heart. I just stopped hoping you'd love me back. And that's a lot harder to fix than a broken vow. He didn't wait for her response. He stepped out onto the concrete landing and pulled the door shut. The click of the deadbolt was the final period at the end of a long, grueling sentence. Jake picked up his bag and walked down the stairs. Outside, the first flakes of real winter snow began to fall, drifting down onto the rusted dumpsters and the cracked asphalt of the Riverside complex. He walked to his beat-up Ford, climbed into the freezing cab, and sat for a moment, staring at the keys he no longer held. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply turned the ignition, waited for the engine to catch, and drove toward the factory, disappearing into the white, silent horizon of a life he had to build all over again, one shift at a time.